The Roaring Twenties, Part 2. The Twenties, Constitutional and Legal Issues. An overview. The Twenties was kind to the native-born white middle-class Americans, but it was not kind to ethnic minorities. Many natives accused minorities of causing city crime and filling up slums. The Communist Revolution in Russia in 1917 fueled the distrust of the foreign-born. The KKK also had a comeback due to the film The Birth of a Nation. The KKK became so big that it controlled the politics of many states. The Sacho Vanzetti case in 1921 became a major source of protest worldwide when many felt that the prosecutor had been unfairly judged and given a death sentence due to their ethnicity. They still got hung, which led to even more worldwide protests about American society. The 20s, Prohibition and the Volstead Act. Many citizens were alarmed by the 19th Amendment and the following Volstead Act. The 19th Amendment prohibited the manufacturing and sale of all alcoholic beverages, and the Volstead Act provided enforcement for the 19th Amendment. The prohibition caused millions of Americans, who usually obeyed the law, to illegally obtain alcohol through bootleggers. Prohibition also greatly increased organized crime as bootleggers started gangs in cities to evade arrest. There was no quality control of alcohol in the illegal market, which led to many Americans dying due to poisoning. The 19th Amendment was finally repealed in 1933. The 20s, Fundamentalism and the Scopes Trial. Background. Modernist theology was a movement where liberal Protestants sought to update Christianity so it became more relevant to contemporary life. Conservative Protestants scoffed at the modernist movement and started the fundamentalist movement. Fundamentalists believed that the society should go back to fundamental Christian doctrines. They took every word of the Bible as a holy truth. Fundamentalism spread quickly during the 20s in rural areas. It created a big divide between urban and rural folk, so basically liberal versus conservative. The Scopes trials in 1925 embodied the clash between the urban and rural people. John Scopes disobeyed Tennessee law by teaching Darwin's theory of evolution. The city folk tended to side with Scopes, and rural folk sided with the prosecutors. The 20s, Restriction on immigration. Immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe was severely restricted by quota laws in 1921 and 1924. Each country was assigned a small number of people allowed into the U.S. based on the number of people from that country who lived in the U.S. in 1920. Any immigration from Asian country was also prohibited. The 20s, Shifting cultural values. An overview. During the 20s, more liberal urban cultural values began to replace the traditional rural cultural values in the U.S. Flappers. They were young women who defied traditional values. They wore one-piece bathing suits, they smoked in public, etc. Many older Americans feared that the underwhelming of traditional values would ultimately lead to the breaking up of the traditional family. And Freud's ideas became popular in the U.S. "Quote-unquote free association" was a method developed by Freud to resolve emotional problems. The 20s, Women's changing roles. An overview. Women in 1917 through 1929 began to challenge old assumptions about their role in society. A little background. During the war, women took up traditional men's jobs such as factory work and farming. Post-war, there was an increase in white-collar jobs for women, but they still often faced less pay for their work. And finally, the 19th Amendment was actually adopted in 1920, which gave women the right to vote. Pre-adoption, many women organized protests and went through hunger strikes. And finally, women realized that they have a power to make great change in politics. The 20s, Harlem Renaissance. Overview. Post-war, there was a flowering of African American arts, and Harlem became the epicenter of the Harlem Renaissance. There were many causes for the Harlem Renaissance, such as mass migration, rising African American expectations post-war, and a newfound interest in traditional African American culture. just African culture. Harlem drew many talented artists and intellectuals that rose to fame. Actors such as Paul Robeson and Josephine Baker, and African Americans were the principal creators of jazz, and jazz took over the nation in the 20s. And even with all their talent, many African American artists often faced discrimination due to their race.